Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast, A Journey Through Nature and Science. I'm your host, Don Murphy. With us on this episode is Daniel Tausan. He holds a graduate degree from the University of British Columbia in stem cell biology with a Bachelor of Science in general biology. He worked in research at the molecular profiling of exercise, looking into comprehensive blood panels in search of biomarkers for predictive health analytics with Molecular U, which we'll hear a little bit about, and the University of British Columbia School of Kinesiology to develop methods for biological aging calculation. So, Daniel, welcome to the program. Is it okay if I call you Dan or Daniel?
Dan's quite common.
Okay, so Dan, welcome to the program. It's really exciting to get a chance to talk to you, especially since our backgrounds are very similar. Most of my listeners know I started my career in medical research, so it's great to get to talk to a fellow scientist about some of these important issues. And they are important issues. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the science behind health, the science behind aging. Hopefully we'll talk a little bit about genetics. We'll talk about why fasting is important to your health. We'll get into maybe a little bit of hard science when we start talking about genetics and telomeres and some of the things like that. And I know you listeners hear a lot of people in the health and nutrition profession throw around things like enzymes are important to your health and probiotics and all of that kind of stuff. We'll talk about that as well. And we'll certainly touch on stem cells also, because so many people have heard about stem cell therapy, and there are a lot of charlatans out there in the world of stem cell therapy. Believe you me, I've dealt with a lot of them in the past. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But first, Dan, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started on this journey that's taken you into health and aging and helping people with their health.
Yeah, absolutely, Don. I mean, the goal was never to do anything with aging. The goal was to be a doctor initially. So I went from being an athlete, played water polo for Team Canada, and then directly into sort of the heavy duty studies. And it didn't really work out for me. They told me I can't be a doctor. I ask too many questions. So they shooed me away. They said you'd spend all day with two patients, and that's not going to work out for us. So then I obviously just gravitated towards going further towards sciences. And the first time I ever heard about recombinant DNA.
So let me interrupt really briefly here and explain to our listeners what recombinant DNA is. It's when you can take a little snippet of DNA and put it into a completely different snippet of DNA. So you're taking in this case, you're taking an external piece of DNA, putting it into a bacteria. In this case, many times it's Escherichia coli, and which has a circular piece of DNA, and you can actually insert through recombining the DNA a completely different code. And Dan's going to tell us a little bit about that, but that's kind of the biochemistry or the molecular biology of what's happening. Two pieces of DNA combining with each other, and it's called recombinant DNA.
So the idea that you can take the human gene and put it inside a bacteria, like insulin, and now you can get the bacteria to produce insulin. You turn a tap, and now you're collecting insulin in buckets. Before we'd have to harvest it from pigs or from very, very difficult to find places. And now all of a sudden, with the understanding of genetics, of genomics, we sort of unlocked the secrets behind life. And to me, that was the coolest thing ever. And I saw science as this sort of utopic field of breaking the boundaries to our reality, to our understanding of what's going on, what it means to be alive. So I got to slap a reality that it's not really how it is. Business really trumps what's going to happen, right? And so like the Human Genome Project, the only reason it happened was because venture capitalists wanted to patent genes. And so, that's the reality. But now you can see that leaves so much opportunity for the rest of us to do something with it. So I pushed the degree up to the PhD, which is still unfinished during COVID. I took a little pause, but I started seeing a lot of individuals. And it was two camps. It was one individual was like, "Hey, I want to stay healthy and keep my health." And so I started promoting, health up. How do you deal with your immune system? And I learned all this because I wanted to be a doctor. So I always took the opportunities when like, hey, if someone comes to my care, what would I do? If someone, even if there's an accident on the airplane and like, is there a doctor on board? I'll first look because I'll let a doctor actually handle it. But if there isn't, I will help. I will be there and I can stabilize you
Well,
until.
speaking of that, back to my original question. That's what I wanted to understand. We really love to hear about our listeners from a human interest point of view first. And so, what was it in your background or in your youth, or maybe an epiphany or an aha moment that led you to want to be a doctor, to want to help people in the first place?
Right. I mean, it was my own health. I think usually when someone gravitates for a specific field, it's usually of a self-interest. And I had a lot of health problems, I guess from birth, from the way in the environment and everywhere. We can talk about maybe the circumstances that I think were a result of that. But I had asthma, I had allergies, like terrible allergies, and I had abdominal problems, irritable bowels. And so as a kid, I was like, why can't I cut myself open and just take the pain out? That's how
Mhm.
I visualize pain to be. There's something in me. I want to be able to open myself up and, just I don't want it in there anymore. And sort of this led me to constantly ask questions. And I'm just a naturally curious individual. Even though I've spent my time very heavily in the biological sciences, I'm pretty good with the physics. I'm very good with the chemistry. And it's just because I like knowing things. I would
Right.
consider myself a student of anything that's natural. I'm not the best at like law or man-made, call it like, rules and structures. To me, that's fleeting. It's interesting, but I have to work really hard in order to be able to keep that type of vocabulary at the forefront. Whereas, people often put biology as this field that you have to memorize a lot. I find not really, because the moment I know how to name something, I can now start talking about the process that's
Sure.
happening within that place. And so life is process. We like to break it up with emotional, spiritual, physical, mental, but those are good structures to describe a process that's happening.
Mhm.
And to me, that's been sort of the driving force as to how do I apply my knowledge to actually make it valuable for people. And it's taken me a long time to realize that the jargon is only important maybe to you, Don, but to the vast majority, 99% of the people, hey, bring it down to a level that's interesting for me. Where I love being on the boundary, on the edge, and I felt it was a necessity to bring people to that boundary so they could work with me in terms of figuring out what's going on here on planet Earth, with us, with genetics and all that stuff. But the reality is most people aren't ready for that task, and so they just
Mhm.
need clear cut instructions about, hey, tell me in more of a black and white way of saying, like, is this good or is this bad? Even though that's not how science operates. Science is on
Mhm.
percentages, margins, probabilities. Very rarely is there a clear good and bad. There's always, call it a context and a consequence. So I went really heavy into the new age technology that's available for us today in terms of the molecular biology, which is going down into a cell and then taking a look at every single message that the DNA is making. So I would take liver tissue, I would take muscle tissue, and I would isolate stem cells from them and take a look at all the messages that are being produced to be able to get an understanding, how do we heal? How do we regenerate? And then I took that
Well,
information.
before we get into that level of detail about what
Yeah.
you're doing, because I want our listeners to know what a stem cell is. I want them to know what
Yeah.
DNA is. I want them to know what a gene is and understand that, because you were talking about jargon earlier. And sometimes we talk about these things quite casually because they're part of our everyday life and we don't realize other people don't know what we're talking about. And so, beginning with what you're just discussing right now, getting down to the cellular level and cell biology. The human body is made up of millions of different kinds of cells, and they're all differentiated. So, when you think of a cell, how do you communicate to a person when you're talking to them and you want to help them? How do you communicate to them what a cell is, what it means to their human body? Whether you give them an example a pancreatic cell or a heart cell or whatever it happens to be? What do you tell them?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it's easiest to start with what you can see and then work down into the unknowns because abstract thinking is a skill. Not everyone has the same I call it level of abstract thinking, and so everyone can take a look at a piece of meat from a grocery store, and what do we see in there? Well, we're always going to see muscle tissue, right? You see muscles, you see connective tissue, all that stuff that people usually chop away. And then the two parts in which are very important is that nervous tissue, we don't normally see that, but we know it very well. If you hit your funny bone or whatnot, it's like, ouch, that's my nervous system. The big, soft, 3-pound gelatinous brain that we have, fatty brain. And then the other one is our barrier, right? So that's where we start. Those are really the four main categories that we can take a look at and assess the health of each. But when we take a look at, let's say, the barrier, they're stuck together beautifully, nicely, and it's the same on the outside as it is on the inside. So your intestines on the outside the barrier, they're doing the exact same thing, and it's just one cell next to another. And so if we think just in these four tissue types, we can get an idea that no matter what cell we're talking about now, a liver cell, where does that belong? That one's really hard. Actually, it's a barrier. What about a pancreas? That one's easy. It's just connective tissue. And the more we talk about where the cells belong, the more that we see that there's this dirty word in science called connective tissue. And if you've ever gone and spoken with a professional and they just wanted to, sweep it under the rug where they didn't want to answer your question easily, they'll say, it's soft tissue or connective tissue damage. But the connective tissue is the most complicated, where your blood vessels, that's connective tissue. Your immune system, that's connective tissue. So, and it's a very important in part there. Now it's like, okay, well, we got a good idea of what a cell is. We know we've pulled blood out. We can see white blood cells. We can see red blood cells. We understand that we are a cellular being. So the really cool part is we have one genome. We have over 200 different types of cells and trillions. It takes trillions of cells to make up a human being. And so it all started from one cell. And the funny part is we all know how to do it. You can't articulate it through language because that's a very slow process and something that's not preview to our, call it, like neural memory, but we have a genetic memory. So every single one of us went from one cell to trillions. And so that embryonic stem cell is a very tricky thing to work with or even understand. How do you go from that one cell into everything in the plethora? Is quite, I would say, magnificent and a miracle. But when
you've introduced this notion or this idea of a stem cell. We're going to talk about that more, but people need to understand that is, you begin, at birth as an embryo from what's called a pluripotent stem cell that can become differentiated eventually to every kind of cell in the body. So you're talking about the fundamental unit of cellular development when you're talking about stem cells. Is that correct?
So not quite. The word stem cell is just referring to a cell that has the ability, like you said, to have multiple potencies. And the idea of pluripotency is it has the information for everything. Correct. And so there's really only one true, call it like stem cell, which has the potency for all different types of cells. And it's just the one cell. And it very quickly differentiates into three different layers, three different types of, call it, stem cells that then give rise to all of our organs and our tissues. So the embryonic stem cell is something that most people don't even need to consider or worry about, because that's not, when stem cells are advertised, that's not what's advertised. You're not using embryonic stem cells. Using embryonic stem cell is going to lead to what's called a teratoma. You're going to get a tumor inside you, and a very dangerous one. And that's known for decades, right? That was known before people had the word stem cell. They knew that cell biology already happened. And so the notion that something can be divided and become something else now becomes a little bit of a little game of where do we draw the line in the sand? Because do we call something a stem cell, or do we give it like a less of a title and call it a progenitor? Something that comes before.
Well, you were saying something about embryonic stem cells that I want to clarify, because people hear that a lot and it's bandied about and it's argued over in political circles and that sort of thing. So it is important in the sense that, researchers who originally started working with stem cells wanted to use embryonic stem cells because they can be stimulated to differentiate into other kind of stem cells that can be used for other purposes, therapeutic purposes as well. And there are some researchers that, probably surreptitiously still use embryonic stem cells. But they are, the pluripotent cell, the stem cell that can differentiate into any other kind of cell eventually. And that's why researchers wanted to use them. And that's why they became so controversial, because they were part of a developing embryo. And many times these embryos were gotten as a result of abortions or other types of things that would go on, and the public would get outraged by the fact that, these types of cells were being used for this purpose. And I just wanted to touch on that for a second so our listeners did understand that there's an
Yeah.
importance to embryonic stem cells. They were used extensively in research at one time. And
Yeah.
fortunately, now the debate and the ethics has taken us away from the need to use embryonic stem cells to the extent that they were used in the past.
Yeah, so, something came about, I guess it's more than a decade and a half ago, where you can now make a close to an embryonic stem cell
Right.
from a lot of different types of cells, and they're called the Yamanaka factors. So Yamanaka is a Japanese scientist who got the Nobel Prize, and it's pretty much reversing the call it the stage of a cell back to a more pluripotent state. It's called an iPS cell, and so now researchers can use that. But embryonic stem cells, I think people get a little bit confused because the vast majority of embryonic stem cells that are researched are mouse. So I think that's a big qualification for people to understand, like the
Right.
vast majority. And it's because one, cost, two, ease of access, three, uh, the mouse has the most infrastructure, the most technology around it. We can cure a mouse of every disease known to man, even genetic diseases. We've taken muscular dystrophy, cured it in a mouse because the mouse has everything set up for it in such a way in which you don't have to worry about, call it, the outcomes for the individual. You can't test on human beings like you can on mice. And
Sure.
so,
Sure.
there's a lot that we learned about how cell biology, how cells function, how life can work, flourish, and thrive from model organisms. So, that's the ethics is absolutely present there, and I think that's a really a conversation with someone I think that's maybe dealt with the forefront and facing. I simply got to a point where when I came to the table, most of it was settled in terms of how you would get access to it, what are the ethical
Sure.
means, and
Mhm.
obviously I'm always for and proponent. You never exploit anyone, nor do you, call it cause harm. And then I think that's
Right.
a very simple, call it scientific ethics, where don't do harm and no
Mhm.
exploitation. So
Exactly.
if you're using someone's, call it, information, they need to be compensated very appropriately for that. And that's actually
Right.
something that caused me to start my business in the way it did, was that when you get your information, let's say it's blood, that's your information. It's very valuable. You don't just give it away to somebody else, and you should have it. You shouldn't let some clinic hold on to it and you don't have access to it or have to pay to get access to it. Every piece of molecular information for yourself will be valuable to somebody else in call it these pharmacology, in industry, in biotech. The biological information, especially if you went through something interesting. Let's say you had a life-altering event and then you healed from it, and you had some molecular data along the way. Well, that's valuable. You could possibly sell that information, and I'm the type of guy to help you sort of put that together and put that forward in front of people. So the absolutely, I think a big conversation that has come to a little bit of a very, call it, under certain understanding with the stem cells, but now there's a sort of this cusp of what's allowed in North America. And North America puts a pretty heavy regulation on human enhancement. And so a lot, there's really two types of stem cell treatments, right? There's the embryonic, or not embryonic, sorry, there's the bone marrow, where
Mhm.
you go into a clinic, your bone marrow is pulled and then injected into a site of injury. Now, in North America, that bone marrow type of treatment is only done on very specific cases, very, nuanced protocols, and it requires an incredible amount of specialty in order to be able to do that type of procedure. But in other parts like South America, there are clinics that have come about in which will do that for you. They'll pull your bone marrow and they'll inject it. For example, like let's say you ripped your Achilles tendon. The Achilles, it doesn't heal very well. But if you simply inject your own bone marrow into the site of injury, it does a phenomenal job of facilitating recovery. The other type is the umbilical cord stem cells. So you once a baby's born, you take what's called the jelly that's around the placenta and the umbilical cord, and you scrape that off, and it's loaded with stem cells, but they're limited in what they can actually do. And so here's a little bit of what's going on in the forefront of, I guess, the understanding is that one, you have to know how to take care of those cells. You can't just take them and inject them right away. You have to really know the steps involved in how to stimulate those cells so that when they go into the area, that they actually do what they're supposed to do. But two, you're also in North America not allowed to do something what's called manipulate those cells in any way before you give it for treatment. And so I know there's some clinics that are just a complete, they have very low efficacy. And I've worked with individuals that have gotten, it's like a $10,000 injection. I said you could have just taken $10,000 and injected into you. But there are some that clearly,
Sure.
which is really funny. I have to say from a outside point of view, like I can evaluate what they put on their websites and forward-facing information, and I can see some of it's wrong. However, their effects on the patients that come out is phenomenal. So obviously they don't care too much about the forward-facing thing. What they do care about is the actual procedure and the effects for the athletes that go in there. And so UFC fighters, people with some big wallets, they have terrible trauma to certain areas, whether it's musculoskeletal or tendon or in those type of those type of realm of injuries, and they get better. So there's quite a difficulty now in saying like, hey, go get stem cell treatment. I don't think we're really at the point to send you there, but to realize it's also a little bit of a marketing buzz where the cells themselves aren't actually you're not taking the cell, it's not becoming you. Rather, those cells are releasing factors that are then helping to heal the environment. Because the moment anybody can figure out how to take cells and engraft them, meaning you take those cells and I want to stitch them into the place of your cells, that's Nobel Prize, like probably one of the biggest Nobel Prizes in history ever, because that's something unbelievably difficult, right? Our body doesn't like to take in tissues that aren't ours, and you will reject them very quickly. And really what you do is you destroy the tissue that comes in. And
Well,
so,
you mentioned the bone marrow, though, and I know people that are friends of mine and relatives that have gone through that treatment where they have taken out the bone marrow, the white blood cells, for example, the stem cell portion stimulated them to make new white blood cells, and then re-injected them into to the patients, and then they are able to make viable and no longer diseased white blood cells, and it's the same with some tissue as well. So it's a fine thing that you're talking about between, for example, taking a heart stem cell, putting it in your body and growing a new heart because your other heart's damaged. And that's what you're talking about. I mean, that kind of thing is not, possible and yeah, clearly would be beyond Nobel Prize. It would be beyond believable. Although, there are researchers who do take individual embryonic cells, stimulate them to become heart cells, for example, and then get those cells to start beating. Now, you
yeah.
could certainly argue that that's not a real heart, but but that's the kind of research that's being done, and there are some researchers that are hoping one day to actually be able to grow a heart in the petri dish. But as you say, that's a ways off to be able to do something like that.
It could take us, decades, or it could be within the next year or two, because the call it the eureka moment can happen very quickly. And when it
Sure.
does, then there'll be a really big rush of how to bring it into, the settings where you can make the tissue. And now with the call it the technology, you can take, for example, your skin cells, you can change them back into a pluripotency, you can make them into a heart cell, and then you can, try and engraft them in. But we're also getting to a point where that just might not be feasible for the everyday individual, right? This might
Yeah,
be something that's
absolutely.
exclusive and tiered system. And I know that sounds bad initially, but keep
No,
in
I know
mind
what you
that
mean.
it has to start somewhere, right? Someone eventually
Right.
has to pay for it, and then it will trickle down, with years to come. But obviously, that's nothing I can speak to. I can just speak to call it the what's in front of us today, and what I understand in terms of the cell biology.
Well, speaking of which, when we were talking earlier, this kind of gets down to the foundation of some of the work that you've done and what you believe in. And I use the word belief on purpose because we're going to talk about that a little bit because we did before. But I want to understand how you describe science today on a molecular and cellular level as it relates to health and well-being. Um, because when we were talking earlier, you spoke about, what is science? What does it really mean? And when you asked that question, I kind of wanted to drill down into what it means on a molecular and cellular level for the everyday person when you're talking about the science of molecular or cellular biology.
Yeah, so I think science is very intuitive, and most people have it like in their subconscious. And often, when you read too much or get inundated with too much information, you have difficulty articulating it. But
Mhm.
science is very simple. It's evidence-based knowledge. It's the examination and study of life. It's a tool that we use to build up a knowledge base of the world around us. And so, if you've done quality science, anybody can pick up where you left off and continue growing those type of models or informational systems.
Mhm.
If you've done very poor quality science, people have no idea what you've done. They don't know what you've compared to, and your work is useless. And so this is true no matter what field we talk about. And I think that can give people somewhat of a bearing to understand that a lot of stuff may look like science. It's like Halloween. You dress up, but you're not really a pirate. You're not really a ghost. And it's not really science. And so data is the foundation of where you really make or break the tedious aspects of science, right? And everything is data. You, by the nature of existing, you give metrics to the world. If we take your blood, those are biomarkers. If we take how fast you run, that's a biometric. And so all of that is useful within a context of how creative can I get to be able to take that information and make some kind of model. So science is very simple. We observe, we measure, and then we predict things. And if you're not doing those three, you're not doing science. And so there's a lot of marketing present in today's day and age that is there to try and get you to believe something that doesn't have the data to back it up, but it's confused or at least color coded its data, transformed it so many times that they can get away with saying like, oh, this drug is 25% effective. But if you know a little bit about statistics, they just lied to you. They had 100 individuals. In the control group, they had 4 people that got better, and in the experimental group, they have 5 people that got better. That's a 20% increase. So you can see how you really quickly not do science. You can do very clever
Right.
marketing. And so,
Well, and not so you make a distinction between what you call science and story. So you seem to be saying that industry or marketing tells stories based on poor science, and then there's real science that is not story, but is based is evidentiary, and experiments can be done and repeated, and predictions can be made, and that's what you understand as science. But when somebody takes, a study and 25%, 20 people get well, you know, out of 100, that's, 20% efficacy. And then they say, what a great drug I have. And that's a story. That's
yeah,
not science.
yeah, absolutely. And even within the laboratory, so when we go to publish, we say like, what story can we put together? Because we have all these different experiments, and when you want to put together a publication, you can't just throw all the experiments in together that you think are relevant. No, someone's going to come and be like, no, I want this figure. Can you make this experiment so we have this story? We're actually telling stories in science today, which I think is actually a terrible direction that we've taken with our with our industry. Whereas the amount of information that's stuck in laboratories that never makes it out is like 10 times more than what actually is published. So just imagine with all the information that's done, if it was posted on, if we flip to how the script of how it worked. You have a laboratory, no matter what you do, you post your results onto your own website. Your laboratory showcases the science that you do. We would be light years ahead, right? We would also be in patent races, and it would be quite a different world. But to understand that, the science that we see today is very much so selected and filtered. And this is where I come in with, well, what science can we connect to? Because you can be your own N of one experiment. You are your own N of one experiment. You are the only person like you on the planet. And though, I think we talked about raw food. Though raw food might work very well for one individual, it might not work for the same individual later in life. Maybe they really did poorly with maintaining their hydrochloric acid in their stomach. Now they're no longer competent to have the raw food diet. They have to get back to a certain state before they can start it again. And so we might fall into certain biological trends, like on, you get your blood test and you're like, yeah, okay, I'm in the right range. But when we start looking at, I've gotten a little bit of a head start in what goes on in our blood, because I've got to see blood panels that are 300, even 1,000. The 1,000 ones I've only looked at a few because that takes way too long. The 300 I worked out to build my databases around. And so there's a lot going on the inside, and the amount of difference between one person and the other, heck, between two brothers, is still quite large. And so you're trying to make sense of this unbelievable molecular orchestra that's happening underneath to keep us alive. And there's too many, call it like a bystander effect, compensatory mechanisms coming to play. Not everything that changes is actually causing what you would say are symptoms, or even call it benefits. And so I was quite interested in two parts here with the blood particularly, is that, can I see your blood and determine whether you are resilient to disease? And the best place I found to look was within exercise physiology. So this is how I connected with the School of Kinesiology. Was I have this very extensive cell biology, molecular biology background, and I just had a very simple question: is that you go to a doctor, you're like, hey, I want to get healthier. I'm healthy, but I want to get even better. They tell you, get the hell out of my office. Right? Come back when you're sick, when I can actually help you. What are you doing here, wasting our time? And the guy, obviously, right? So this entire field that's present about health optimization, that people have to understand where to look for it, right? The doctors are doing something very difficult. They're there to stabilize you when you mess up, right? Like if you need critical care, that's the best thing our hospitals do. They're not good for the chronic diseases. They're not set up for it. They're not taught, because they're always going to play the game of we don't know the cause. And you have to, because you don't have time to sit down individually, be like, all right, well, tell me what you've been doing for 10, 20 years, and let's try and, make guesses, and then we'll go through a process of elimination. They're not going to do that. Let's get real. So don't harp on the doctors because they're not trained for that. You know how to use them. That's at least my 2 cents. And so in the blood, I saw really one way of assessing whether you're super resilient. And I started looking towards military publications of individuals that overcome large amounts of stress. When you overcome large amounts of stress and you rise to the challenge, your body now adapts to be more resilient. So what does that look like on a molecular level? And for me, what I did was simply take a look at concentration values. There's lots of ways to go about it, but I can take a look at concentration values of, I need more than just call it your, white blood cell count. Cholesterol is not bad, especially if you can get it broken down into the components, right? Cholesterol comes, people I think are very familiar, good and the bad, right? Which is absolutely nonsense in terms of biology, because they're both vital molecules. If you don't have the bad one, you're dead. If you don't have the good one, you're dead.
So just so our listeners understand, you're talking about, you're going to look at concentrations. You're talking about looking at concentrations of different biomolecules or biomarkers. So you just used cholesterol as an example. There are many others when you do a blood test that come up. So you were trying to discover particular biomolecules that told you something about how these people recovered, what made them better, what made them healthier. Is there something, a telltale sign that's left in your blood that you can actually quantify and look for?
Yeah, absolutely, Don. Yeah, thanks for bringing me back there. And that's exactly it. Can I see your blood panel and, without ever meeting you, determine whether you fit into what I would call one of three categories? Hey, you're not doing so good. You got some type of condition. Can I pick up what that condition is? Is it prediabetes? Is it an inflammatory signal? Is it Crohn's, IBS, anything like that? Is it a liver condition? So on and so forth. So that's one category, and that category is the most complicated, because when stuff starts going wrong, people, like the liver, for is a good example. You can have the same call it liver diagnosis, but you can get there a lot of different ways. So the Z signal very complicated, but when something's wrong, you can clearly tell like something's wrong. In which case is some little bit of a not that helpful. You know, you go to your doctor like, "Hey doc, I'm feeling off," and then he gets a blood test. Yeah, you're off. It's like, thanks, I knew that. And so a lot of what's available in the clinic is just it confirms that there's a problem, and we do okay in terms of specificity. Like, okay, yeah, your liver is like showcasing a problem, but the thing is that the liver maintains the blood. So liver is always working. It's always trying to contribute to helping the other organs as well. So we have one category. The other category I would say is the average, the civilian, the someone who hasn't spent their life in, pushing themselves in terms of some kind of stressor, and they haven't yet had any problems with their health. So they fall in this middle category. In the exercise physiology, they would be called as untrained. You'd be like, this is your group, they're untrained individuals. But the moment that you start engaging in some type of stress, and I say not just exercise, I say stress because heat stress will make you more resilient. So you put yourself in heat stress scenarios, your body now starts producing molecules, proteins, physiological adaptations so that you can better survive the stress. So human beings have this unbelievable adaptation mechanism, which we're really soft, very supple, very vulnerable creatures, but we adapt very well. And so in the blood, you can see that the individual adapts well to cold stress, heat stress, exercise. And those are some of the big ones. The psychological stress is a lot harder because you don't necessarily correlate it to blood that easy, but the physical ones are a lot easier. And so when someone adapts to exercise, their concentration of biomarkers in their blood changes. And that's a really good idea for me to be able to be like, okay, hey, you're doing better. You're not just healthy now, you're really healthy. Or, hey, I know you've been training really hard, but your blood is actually showcasing not a good response. You're overtraining and you're not getting the adaptation you want. So we can take a look at certain, like your heart rate's a good example. We can take a look at the blood, but we can just take a look at your big organ and say, well, how did your heart rate adapt? And if you've been an athlete, or even if you just you played sports for a certain amount of time, there's a very good chance that your heart is adapted to be very, call it, resilient. And so
Well,
this is
let me ask you a difficult question here.
shoot.
Because you are saying, you should be able to at some point look at a person's blood. You're doing your own research, trying to understand, what these biomarkers might be and what story they may be telling you. And more than that, in a more nuanced and refined point, you're saying there's differences between twins, for that matter, in terms of what you might find indicates from their blood whether or not they're healthy or whether or not there's a problem or what they may need to do to become even healthier. So are you, headed to a point where you're hoping to develop a product or a process? You talked about process earlier, where someone comes to a physician or comes to you, or an athlete comes and you draw their blood and you look at this particular biomarker. You say, yes, this is what is wrong with you or right with you, and what you need to keep on doing or you need to stop doing. And so are you hoping to get to a point with your research where you're really developing that kind of a database?
Absolutely, yes. That is the goal, and that's also what I've worked with clinics and companies to help develop.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I have this tentative answer of, when you develop an algorithm off a data set, it works for about 60% of the people. And that's okay. But if you give me a person and we sit down and we can take a look, and I have a lot more time, we have biological databases in which there isn't sort of too many unknowns for what's going on with a particular protein. And so we can take now any protein, bring it up and see its connection, web of connections. It's called bioinformatics, all the information around that biomolecule. And now we can sit and see why that individual, for example, came out as, like 105 on my biological age calculator. And it's like, okay, you have a lot of things in a really weird range in comparison to everyone else. You don't fit this model for us to be able to apply this type of analysis for you. And so this is now what I'm seeing is that a lot of people don't fit into a nice category to be able to put them in, and give them a response that's kind of like, hey, you're doing great or you're not. And the important part, the most important part, why it's, you know, I find pleasure in what I do, where I see it's going to take quite a long time to be able to bring out, call it really what's happening with the biology, is that we need individuals across time. We
Mhm.
need, and that gives us way more information than a whole bunch of different individuals with one time point. And in,
Mhm.
in science, it's called a cross-sectional comparison. So I can take, you know, people in North Carolina, people in Washington. I can take the same age, and I can compare those two. That's cross-sectional comparison, and that has a lot of like things you can't control for. Whereas I take you just on, and I take your
Mhm.
blood, I put you in a program, and I take your blood again. That's a million times more insightful of what's happening, what can shift, because now I'm taking account of everything. I don't have to throw data out to in order to be able to try and understand it. I don't have to be like, oh, there's outliers. This guy smokes. This guy eats, too much processed food. Oh, this guy's eating raw food. Oh, this guy's eating. I don't have to deal with any of that. I just deal with what you're telling me, what you're willing to do in terms of now trying to factor it in. And because so much of the fundamental science has already been done, like we know the hormones that control digestion, we know the hormones that regulate muscle growth, we know the hormones that regulate, your sleep wake cycles, and so we don't need to now play this guessing game when we see something change, being like, well, we don't know what this means. Like, no, we're in a very interesting part in, I think, like our actual scientific endeavors, because people have been kind enough to make the databases to share this information because they see the importance and the value. And I'm the guy that can simply pull up the information and read it. It's like a lawyer with all the legal jargon. There's biology and the biology jargon, right? And knowing which parts, call it, bring value, and which parts are just describing certain things which are irrelevant, is very hard for someone that hasn't spent 2 decades in the nitty gritty of it all. And so,
Well, you know, what you're saying brings up, something that happened, contemporarily, uh, within the last, 5 to 10 years, and came to a head, unfortunately, in a disaster in our scientific community, with the company. I'm sure you're very familiar with Theranos in Silicon
right.
Valley. That had this idea that from a drop of blood, that they could somehow, just from a drop of blood, diagnose, what ails you, you know, from a pinprick of blood. And unfortunately, that just was not true. And so, and that might fall, into the story part of, science, where, you take some of what you're doing, the very thing that you're doing actually, where you're collecting data and information and that sort of thing, and then you create a story behind it, which turns into a corporation, which turns into fraud, which turns into people being victimized, mostly financially in this case, because I don't think any of this ever made it to the market. It certainly wasn't okayed by the Food and Drug Administration. So there was never an instance where, people were victimized, but it sure tells a story about, the science. And so I bring it up in the context of, some of what you're talking about is heading in that direction. And I'm asking you now how you would differentiate what you're doing from what this woman, who I can't remember her name, Elizabeth Holmes,
Hmm.
tried to
Yeah.
do with Theranos.
Yeah, I think this is actually an awesome example of where everybody that was in the field of metabolomics, proteomics, which is studying, call it, all of as many metabolites as you can catch, as many proteins as you can catch in the blood. eh, If you asked any one of them, if you asked me at the time, we all had the very
Wow.
fast conclusion, like, this is not possible, because we know where technology is at. We know what technology we're using. We're actually using very old technology, but we've just modernized it so that, one, it's super cheap
Mhm.
relatively, right? $500 is not $10,000, and so we found ways in which we can use. And if people are familiar with what a mass spectrometer is, to me, it's the call it gold standard of absolute quantification. So what that means that if you wanted to get a concentration value, it's very hard to do that for molecules. Like there's a lot of molecules. How do you get to a real number? Well, you can do that with mass. Hey, it weighs this much. I've made sure that the only thing I'm looking at is one molecule at a time, and I know all the atoms there. And so that's what a mass spectrometer does. It literally just calculates the mass, and so you're not dealing with any other, call it, in between to change your concentration value. So because we know the technology that's available, we know what you have to do to get to a measurement. And we know that the only way that you can do that is you have to like set it up beforehand. Like you can't go in and get everything. You have to decide what you're getting before you go in, if that makes sense. Targeted and untargeted.
What
We
you're
have,
looking for.
yeah. And so for the Theranos one also, like, how do you map all the diseases already when we already know that it's very difficult to know the signatures behind it? Like, we've been combing through literature. Oh God, I mean, we're good at diabetes because there's so many publications on it. But what about, some of these variants of psoriasis or liver conditions? Liver conditions are the most complicated of all. They can come in so many different ways. Kind
Or
of
even
like,
the different kinds of cancers. There are hundreds, if not
absolutely.
thousands, of different iterations of cancer.
And you
Uh,
get really weird signatures from cancers because depending on how the person's got to that metabolic dysfunction, it's going to
sure.
be a different signature in the blood. From what cell types, it's going to be a different signature in the blood. So, I mean, if you, this is, I think, why I say it's a really good example. If you saw that and you were an investor, but you weren't competent enough to find someone that understood science, you could have paid me and said, hey, can you read this and tell me whether it has any bit of validity? You would have saved yourself massive financial fraud. So this is, again, now goes into something which I think our populations, even though it's, where everyone's going through school, has extremely low scientific literacy. You
Mhm.
can't really ask the question, hey, what are you observing? Hey, what are you measuring? Hey, what's your control? Hey, how do you measure? The questions
Right.
aren't difficult. They're very simple. But if you ask those questions, you can tell right away whether the person is filibustering you or whether they're trying to sell you snake oil. And so here's the opposite side of really what's going on is that I'm telling you that my approach is super tedious and long. And that's because as a scientist, that's how I feel confident in order to be able to put some forward that I think is worthwhile and meaningful. I could play the game of making up algorithms and be like, yeah, you got your biological age, this is it. But I've done that, and I was disappointed with how far I could push it with the data sets I had available to me. And so, when I started working more with individuals, I feel a lot more confident because one, I can see them change their life. They're looking to change their life, and I'm there along the ride with them to guide them, to protect them, and to do the work. They give me a blood panel of 300 measurements. I need to sit down and now make up stories. Will I be right 100% of the time? No, but I never claim anything. I try to call it the probabilistic thinking. This is why it takes time. This is why I'm not meant to be a doctor to kind of run people through the office. Rather, I'm there to help evolve and bring whatever is present in front of us to the forefront from how that person is experiencing life. So, like, hey, we see, for example, I have one individual who has very high cholesterol, but now when we got him that fancy blood test, we see that all the molecules that make up the cholesterol are completely fine, except for one, which is called apolipoprotein E, and
Mhm.
we know that one from our biological databases is associated with the brain. So what do we know? We know that the brain is requesting more cholesterol than any other tissue. Do I have a 100% guarantee that's the case? Absolutely not. No. Maybe there is ApoE in this specific scenario is going to the pancreas, but that would be a one in a, there's no evidence to point me to that direction. There is evidence to point quite heavily towards the brain. So this is a thing to understand is that there's stuff we can work off of that you will never get to through an algorithm because that algorithm is waiting for you to exist in order for someone like me to write it. So, this is where we do the work, right? And where I
Well,
found aging.
you're bringing up an interesting point, though. With everything that you just said, leads me because I have a similar background as you. So and it's not the same at every university, but where I went to school, those of us that were physiology, pharmacology, PhD students, did the first 2 years in the medical school. And the reason for that um, was that the medical students were taught basic biology and basic biochemistry and that sort of thing in their first 2 years. But those of us that were in the physiology pharmacology program were training to be the future teachers and trainers of doctors, to the extent that we were required, and this is a really important point to what you're saying, we were required to get grades. In other words, we were judged very harshly. And the medical students were on a pass fail system.
Hmm.
Um, the reason I bring that up is that those of us that were in the physiology pharmacology program had the kind of basic knowledge, and there are hundreds and thousands of physiologists and PhDs out there teaching in medical schools now, who have a fundamental basis of knowledge that can do much of what you're saying right now. And as you pointed out, much of that data and information is out there and is available for us to make decisions on. So it's almost like it's pointing towards the need to revolutionize healthcare, and to the extent that people like yourself, myself, although I left that field 50 years ago, so not me. Don't call me, folks. Uh, could seek out a person like yourself for basic and fundamental information about their health without going to a clinician. Um, and clinicians have basically become pill dispensaries. And I just had a doctor on previous to you on my podcast who talked about this. She's become kind of a medical detective because she didn't get taught in medical school how to diagnose and understand basic illnesses that might be caused, for example, by mold in somebody's house, for as an example. So I'm bringing that up to say that you've got your work cut out for you. You're going to start a revolution out there, it sounds like. And how are you going to get other people to jump on board on the bandwagon, so to speak?
Oh, I mean, this is it, Don. Right? Speaking with yourself and gentlemen like you, really to get the word out of how I think people, they ought to, and it's a very dangerous thing to tell people how they should think, but how they should approach healthcare, and to understand what the medical system can do for you at the moment. People like me aren't being trained. We're sprouting up because one, we see a need. Two, I see an opportunity. And three, I had a really difficult time seeing, call it like the exploitation of people in healthcare. Like, unfortunately, it is a business, right? Even within, our classrooms, when I was there, I was, a decade ago, like you're told why you don't develop drugs for orphan diseases that don't have a lot of people, because they're not going to get money back. And when you have targets for it, you're only going to get funding for certain targets. And all of that to me was just, it hit despair. I hit despair and I said, okay, this isn't it for me. I was told you can only be a scientist if you're going to model disease. And I'm like, I'm all about getting people to thrive, not just kind of like slinky by. Like, I want people to feel great in their bodies, for them to wake up and tell me stories that they did the day before. That's what I'm here for. And
Well, that's a good segue to ask you about, what do you tell people now who come to you, who might seek your advice, whether it's a family member or somebody who knows you? And certainly we're not giving out medical advice on this program, but we can certainly tell people about, their lifestyle and what they're doing to stay healthy.
yeah,
And that
Yeah, so I
sort of
think we
thing.
said at the beginning, is talk a little bit about fasting, right? So there's a lot of things that you have in control over to dictate your health, right? So we talked about blood quite a bit, but you can set your metabolism. When you sleep, what you eat, when you move, what you partake in within a day decides the way that your blood chemistry goes. It's what you do goes so far as how you believe, what you believe in will dictate your blood chemistry. So example, I walk down a street and I see a rope, but I perceive a snake. So what happens? Blood chemistry changes right away. Adrenaline response, but if I don't have fear of snakes, if I'm interested in snakes, maybe it's a different response. Maybe I get excited. Oh, cool, it's a snake. What type of snake? Should I catch it? Should I pick it up? your perception of the world dictates your responses to it. And so that's a big starting point for people to understand that that's not what's talked about within, call it, the sphere of healthcare. So the way that you regulate your emotions is key to your outcomes of your health. The second part to that is that the fasting is very similar to how, call it, the rest and digest and the flight or fight nervous system have to control your body. So I think it's very, very intuitive for most people. We know that we have a nervous system that helps us get up and at 'em, shifts blood to the muscles away from the internal organs. We got to run away from a lion. And then we have the other nervous system, rest and digest, to deal with infections and to digest our food. But it's really rest, digest, recover, redistribute, repair. It's a lot of stuff that goes on with this nervous system. So our flight or fight can, within a millisecond, completely stop that in order for us to run away from danger. Now, if we're out of danger, but we're still stressed about work, we're still stressed about a social scenario, we're still stressed about our whatever it is, but we're supposed to be resting, adjusting, repairing, redistributing, recovering, we're not. And so we get into a state of completely inhibiting our recovery systems. And that's the fastest way to advance your aging at a rapid rate, is one, damage your recovery systems. And this is where fasting, number two, is key, because fasting is, call it, the best way in order to be able to get your metabolism to start doing the cleaning process. Because the moment I eat, I must deal with the incoming nutrients. There's no option. It's the same thing like the flight or fight. It completely overrides the rest and digest. So eating completely overrides your ability to clean your system, and your liver needs to clean your blood. So we talk about blood a lot. It's pretty simple. If your blood's clean, if you give me your blood panel and it's clean, you're very likelihood to have a very good bill of health without getting, call it, these chronic diseases around the ages 55, 60 that most people start seeing them, and even earlier now. So fasting would be number three. Number two. Number three, and it's a very hard one, but your mood and temperament. So I kind of mentioned there, and I think we've talked about it, belief, and how your belief can set your whole entire health into a certain direction. But your temperament is absolutely key. So you being super angry, like, hey, I want to see, like, call it, the Denver Nuggets lose or Denver Nuggets win, whatever it is, that can hold you on the planet. But if you are in a state of joy, happiness, call it gratitude, you live longer. So for the centurions, I've spent a lot of time studying people that make it to 100. I've interviewed quite a few, and they have a certain like laissez-faire. Things roll off their back really easily, and they're full of fun. Even they're 100 years old, and they're still trying to like bust my chops. They've just met me, and they like teasing me about I like, kind of like you said, about the work ahead of me. And so they have a certain, call it, mood or temperament, and we know this from science in ways in which might be a little bit difficult to relate, might take a little bit too long, but the mood and temperament is absolutely key to you being resilient. So much so where I think it overrides. For example, I have someone that's 90 years old, 91, terrible blood profile. Looks like they should have been dead a decade ago, but they're still alive. So there's something to say about this, like, desire, this purpose, behind us living. Number
Well,
four,
can I?
yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I
yeah.
want to hear number four.
Number 4 and 5 here are pretty easy. Number 4, very simple, is that you have to take care of your digestion. Digestion is very expensive. And if you constantly keep taxing your digestion, you're just running through your, call it, currency faster. And so this is weird one. I'll say it with a little bit of apprehension, but a tiny, tiny bit of alcohol. We're talking a thimble full of distilled liquor, high concentration liquor, not beer, none of that stuff, acts to help you in digestion. And so in the northern Europe, in Hun Valley, in Hunza Valley, probably in Afghanistan, you have the mountains within Ethiopia, Tanzania, you have Okinawa, Japan, you have all these places on the planet, and all of them have a distilled liquor. And all of them are pretty consistent about consuming them in a very small quantity. No one's getting smashed or drunk. So, but where do I relate that to? I relate that to digestion, because we know that Digestive enzymes are very expensive to produce. And if you're constantly taxing your system, you're dying faster. And then the last one is exposure to cold. If you can see on the planet, when you go to the poles, the creatures get bigger. Where's the biggest penguin? It's in the poles, right? It's in the South Pole. So the cold is a stressor that helps you. For the human being, we're very, very special where it actually helps us really much dissipate energy from our body. And you think like, well, I want energy. Like, well, actually, too much energy and you not being able to hold on it properly is what's causing the radical damage. It's causing us to age and accelerate and call it these diseases. And so those are the five, right? It's the fasting, it's the mood, it's the exposure to cold, also hot, but the cold seems to be more potent. The temperament and the digestion, or I believe I
Well,
said
that's
temperament. Yeah.
I just wanted to validate, and it's anecdotal, of course. Us being scientists, I'll give that qualification right away. But I mean, there's science behind it in the context of what you're saying. For example, knowing your body, knowing what you are. So I was having all these skeletal muscular problems that I've had all of my life. Finally, I came to the understanding and conclusion because those problems were mitigated every time I would do exercise or particularly certain kinds of weightlifting and that sort of thing. Those problems were mitigated. But as I got older, some of those problems got worse. And I kept saying that this is skeletal muscular. And I found out, very easily or quickly that it had to do with the fact that I was sitting during the day way, way too long. So you see me standing now, and I'm a huge proponent of standing personally for myself in terms of health, because if I don't stand a certain amount of time during the day, and if I'm not minimally active in standing and walking, really help with that, then these other skeletal muscular problems crop up very quickly. Another anecdotal thing about that goes with number two or three of what you said, having to do with attitude. So I just had treatment for HPV related cancer in one of my tonsils. HPV, unfortunately, is very common in the population these days, and unfortunately, under certain circumstances, it can lead to cancer. But when I went in, for treatment, and it was caught very early, and interestingly enough, it was caught early because the skeletal muscular problems kept cropping up, and the doctor said, "Well, we should do this X-ray, and we should do this and that." And I said, "Well, the exercise is really helping, and if I stand," but they caught the cancer very early on, so I went in for treatment, and during the course of the treatment, both the chemo oncologist and the radiation oncologist, who didn't agree, by the way, and that's another story that I'm telling on my podcast here soon. I'm having them both on to talk about the reasons they didn't agree in their cancer treatment and that sort of thing. But anyway, but they both said, "Oh, you do better than 99% of the people who have the same problem that it's amazing. You're going to be fine." Because they started off telling me, "Oh, you might have to have a feeding tube. This is bad, that's bad, this kind of side effect that, you're really going to will really suffer through it." And the side effects were bad. But I honestly, and this is no exaggeration, when I got the diagnosis, my feeling was I was just so happy and grateful for the life that I had lived up to this point. And I didn't care what the prognosis was. And I still don't, well, I mean, the prognosis now is that it's not going to come back and that they're all happy with that sort of thing. But I went into it with a very happy and positive attitude. And I think that made all the difference, despite, some of the complications from the and side effects from the treatment. So I just want your listeners to know that he's absolutely on the right track. I can bear witness as somebody who just went through a difficult period, that attitude has everything to do with the recovery of your body, your health, so that if you are ill or if you're going through difficult times, attitude has everything to do with it.
So I would say, Don, that's the real science that I'm talking about,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you might have started that with saying it's anecdotal, but keep in mind that all good science starts with an anecdote. You got
That's
to,
true.
And all that really says is that it's an observation without the scientific rigor. But to me, you've described quite a few things in which I would put down as sort of these, sort of like massive observations to build our knowledge base off of. And one is that there was a relief when you found out, like, hey, I have all this, I've had this issue long before, now it's getting exacerbated. Hey, what a relief to have some kind of closure or at least identity behind this. I can recognize and point to the problem now. And so that's a big part, I think, in which is the real science, right? Yeah,
Right.
I think the energetic side, this sort of your feelings, are very hard to talk about in, call it, quantitative ways.
Right.
However, we must try and make a best it can be approach, because now I can't ignore you. You're a real person. You differed from the rest of the cohort that might have, those doctors seen. And I'm interested. I want to know what really was the edge that you had. And it's something I think that you can't necessarily give to another person when they're at, you call it, that part. They had to do the
Yeah.
work beforehand. And this
Mm-hmm.
is where I can't stress enough, whereas like when you have your health, you need to work and maintain and keep your health, because when you lose it, there's some chances, like we talked about, there are parts in the body where you have adult stem cells, but if you mess up your heart, it has no adult stem cells. If you mess up the liver, it can regenerate up to a certain point, but then it's going to get exhausted. And so, this is, I think, the tools in front of us, and who we get to interact with really makes a big difference about where our timeline on this planet can take. Right, that's the idea of my company here, Timeline Sciences, is that we all share the exact same space. This is one beautiful world, and where our time goes. Well, science can help you decide what the outcomes for you will be. Right, you will have 98% of us have all the genetic, called superpowers, that you need in order to have
So
a healthy
true.
life. And the
Right.
regenerative capacity of your body is immense. It's really about knowing how to not impede it, know how to
Right.
take things away or bring to it, so that you can kickstart those regenerative processes.
Well, the other thing, I hope you'll do this, and there's certainly some research, and I can give you some references. But the one thing you didn't mention is nature and the environment, and being in nature and the environment, which is, I mean, I left medicine to go into the nature and environment, and that's been my career for the last 50 years. But um, somewhere mid-career, I became friends with E.O. Wilson, famous Harvard biologist, who wrote a book called Biophilia. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in that particular book, he talked about how, to make a long story short, about how the healing capacity of nature, and how important it is for people to be in nature. And he wasn't the only one. The famous landscape architect, um, Frederick Law Olmsted, he did Central Park and a whole bunch of other wonderful places, um, and wrote an early report on Yosemite National Park. Uh, but both of them recognized how important the environment is to your health and your well-being, particularly psychologically, and then what that does to you physically as well. And Frederick Law Olmsted actually called that out in one of his reports on Yosemite. And interestingly enough, while he did focus a little bit on um, corporate America and CEOs and people stuck in offices, his main focus was on the domestic work that women do, and how difficult it is, and how they rarely get relief from it, and how important the environment and being out in parks happens to be to their health and well-being. And he gave that as one of the principal reasons why Yosemite should be kept as a national park and available for people to have for recreational purposes, but also for their long-term health and well-being. So I would check out the book Biophilia. There's been a lot of other papers written on that since. This was back in the 80s that he wrote the book, or no, mid 90s.
Yeah,
Early.
I would 100% throw that back and say you're absolutely right. And it really goes into the I guess the first thing I said was recovery systems, where I
Right.
kind of touched a very very big. Sleep is sort of the big recovery system, But
Right.
you're one of my favorite quotes, which I have no idea now who the original person said it is, but one that I say quite often is that you can't have A plus health in a C minus environment, right? So
Right.
you that's really the extension of you, and
Right.
being within nature, being within the ground, the soil. Even though there's some really weird ideas where you want to stay away from the soil because it has too many microbes, it's the exact opposite. Is that if you're having a lot of issues, you want to put yourself in that scenario, and your body will be you learn it'll get entrained, and like the last I think 2 decades really has gone into some of the nuances where when you walk through a forest, you're showered with volatile oils from the trees. Like when you smell and you breathe in, is a
Ah,
relaxant.
yes.
So
Right.
we talked about how our psychology can completely inhibit our rest and digest. Well, these volatile oils seem to work really well with the vagus nerve, with the parasympathetic nervous system, in order to get us in a state of recovery.
Yeah, if you
So
walk through a grove of sugar pines, I can tell you it's therapeutic, and you talk about aromatherapy. There's nothing like walking through a sugar pine forest.
yeah, and the more that we spend time observing it, the more nuances we find. So I'm sure the volatiles are one way. How visually seeing it, I too wonder how big of a
Oh, yeah,
impact that has on us. Because even if I see
absolutely.
my screensaver here, I'm on a computer quite often. Even seeing the screensaver brings me some relief. The green, the water that I have as the background, and so the Centurions. This is some stuff. I put the top five. If you notice, the exercise didn't even hit the top five,
Right.
where walking is sufficient. People
Hmm.
that never really
Absolutely.
lifted weights. Now, I don't
Hmm.
recommend this. When I put protocols together, I try and, regardless where the person is within their lifespan, I try to find, segments or areas where if they're in a, let's say, Honda Civic chassis, let's build out, a BMW. If they're in a BMW, let's make your Ferrari, meaning let's change your cardiovascular system. Let's change your musculoskeletal health, your joints. So sure, you can make it to 100, but it's a lot nicer to be, have a higher quality of life than it is just to have a long life.
Right.
And exercise is important, but walking seems to be sufficient, which is a really nice sort of, call it like I think a breath of fresh air for people that don't necessarily like exerting themselves. And
Yeah.
so
Well,
there's a lot.
John Muir talked about it as sauntering through
Yeah.
the wilderness, and sauntering is a good word substitute for walk to
Yeah.
because it means that you're relaxing while you're walking and observing and seeing and breathing correctly and taking it all in.
Yeah, and so another part for where it's not really talked about when you talk. I think people have seen the blue zones or different things on longevity, but when you take a look at the centurions, when you have quality sleep, that also means that you rise with the sun and that you spend time outdoors. Right? These things often aren't really talked about, but they rise with the sun and then they go do things and they take a nap at like 2 o'clock. If you notice, like the European
That's me.
lifestyle. Nice. You're even Japanese and different parts. They have like this sort of like midday. Hey, we're going to close down shop for a small little power down, and so
Mhm.
the environment is absolutely key, right? And if your environment's polluted, it's very unlikely that you yourself can really push the boundaries. And this is the part where within a lifetime, it's very hard for they call it heavy duty science, which sometimes people really like wait for. But keep in mind that you might wait a lifetime in order for someone to be like, yeah, you're right. Something that was so
Right.
obvious. And so don't wait for the
Exactly.
publications, right? Use what creation gave you, the rationale, the will, the intellect, and put that at play.
Well, here's another anecdote
Yeah.
from the Bible. So there's a section of the Bible where I think it's the Apostle Paul is talking to uh, one of his disciples, a young man that he was nurturing, and he was having stomach problems. You mentioned this digestion, and in the Bible, I don't remember um, what particular book it's in the New Testament, but it was very clear. Paul said to him, and this is almost a quote, and take a little bit of wine for your digestion. It'll help you.
Interesting. I didn't know that passage.
Yeah.
That's
I'll send it to you.
Yeah, that's very awesome. I have a little bit of inkling that actually the New Testament is a biology textbook.
Yeah, I
And
tell
it
you.
talks about pineal gland, pituitary gland. I've held that belief for quite a while, but that's at least from a biologist's perspective. So obviously I'll
There's a
see
lot of
biology if I
information
want to.
here. Well,
Yeah,
Dan, this has been wonderful. We got to wrap it up, and maybe I'll have you back on again. I have a couple of people coming on to talk a little bit more in depth about cellular and molecular biology. Dr. Wheeler's coming on here pretty soon, and we're going to talk about some things in molecular biology and biochemistry as well from his years of research. And he's, been actively seeking to be a podcast guest because he wants to communicate more about biology and science. So when I got up this morning, I said, there needs to be a Neil deGrasse Tyson for biology. You know,
I think you fit that niche, Don. You got the
so,
background where Neil deGrasse Tyson's
because
got the physics down, but his biology could use some work.
that is very true, and I'm really concerned, and I don't mean to get political on this podcast, but I am concerned that if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. becomes anywhere close to being in charge of the biology and health of the people of the United States of America, we're in trouble, and you're going to need another voice out there talking about what real science is. So anyway, that's my political statement for the day. No hate mail, folks, please.
No, no, we want discourse. We want to be able to talk about what's on the
Right,
forefront and bring forward the evidence,
right.
and let's get to it. Right, like nothing is really, I think, off the chopping block. And I think with the amount of biotechnology coming at hand, we should be light years ahead. Right, let's not let
Yeah,
industry prevent advances that could be beneficial for mankind.
absolutely. Thanks, Dan. Let's do it again.
Hey, Don, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much,
All
and
right.
hopefully we didn't go too deep down the rabbit hole.
No, I think this was absolutely wonderful. You have a wonderful rest of the day.
Hey, likewise, Don.
Take care. And we have blog pages on each and every one of these podcasts so you can learn more about the guest and what they're doing and keep track of this particular subject. As always, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.